Landfills alone represent about 17% of US methane emissions.
ETH moving away from proof of work towards proof of stake.
In our view, Bitcoin is a completely different animal than any other sort of cryptocurrency.
I think that that's the same type of thing that people do with like cryptocurrencies.
Bitcoin mining will be an overwhelmingly positive force.
Well, Adam, this has been a long time coming. I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. Kent, our president and chief operating officer here, has said so many incredible things about you. So it's incredible to finally get to put a face to a name, and I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, well, the pleasure's all mine, Will. It's obviously, really excited to meet you, the SaaS behind SaaS mining. It's not every day where you meet somebody with your prestige. So really, really excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, well, I listened to the episode that you did on the What Bitcoin Did podcast. And I think that the conversation that you're having on this front is as important as it really gets, not just for our particular part of the ecosystem, like the whole Bitcoin community, but also just to help spread the message and broaden that. So I'm excited to dive into that. But even before going down that whole conversation, I'm curious, what is it that got you into what you're doing at Vespene today? Like, what'd you do beforehand?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my background is I'm a mechanical engineer by training. Most of my career has been spent in underwater engineering, so primarily submarines and remotely operated vehicles. I did do a 3-year stint also in 3D printing as well, but my primary career was personal submarines for recreation and tourism. I used to run a company called Deep Flight. We had tourism bases set up all over the world. And, our mission was to increase awareness of the oceans and ocean conservation in general. My grandfather was founder of an ocean, nonprofit called the Oceanic Society. I come from a long line of conservationists and environmentalists, but I've also been a holder of Bitcoin for a long time. I got into Bitcoin in 2017. And I've always understood the social aspects of Bitcoin from it being a decentralized monetary network, and that the fact that there's, no government can come in and seize it. And I've always agreed with these types of attributes, but I've also really deeply understood because of my engineering background, I've understood a lot of the energy dynamics as well. And part of the mission of Vespene is to help to change the narrative around Bitcoin and proof of work more broadly into something that can actually be used as a tool to facilitate positive ramifications for the climate, but also renewable energy development in general. And so the genesis of Vespene was actually here in Berkeley, where the company is founded. There's a park in Berkeley that used to be a landfill, and it closed in the 1970s. It was covered over and put into a nice park for dogs. But right there in the middle of the landfill, in the middle of the park, there's this big enclosed space with kind of a giant smokestack sticking out. And we were sort of, what is that thing? And you get up closer and you see the smokestack is in fact flare, and you can see the heat kind of shimmering off the top. And that got us thinking, man, there's this perfectly good wasted energy source that's just getting burnt right here. And that got us thinking about landfills and the impact that landfills have from a methane perspective, both from a environmental methane emissions perspective, but also just a hugely wasted resource of valuable energy. And so, Vespene kind of puts those things together.
It's incredible. I first heard about like this type of use case for the excess methane slightly before I had Chase from Crusoe on, and it just the dots just connect there. I mean, it seems like a perfect value add from every single perspective, not just the Bitcoin side, but obviously from the conservation side, from the economic side. And then I was speaking with Kent in depth about what it is that you guys were working on. I thought it was incredible. And I'm curious, it seems like you have all these different pieces of your background that kind of led to it, technologist background as well as the conservationist approach, and you saw how these connected. And so I'm curious with what it is that you've noticed after diving in from that first genesis of the idea for the company to the actual research and stuff that you discovered as you dove down the literature and the research there. What are some of the high level things that anyone who's out there watching can kind of think about, take away, and realize why is this so important?
In that process of research after the sort of the genesis block, let's say, of Vespene, the main thing that we've really learned is just the vast scope and depth of the methane problem. I think that if you look at landfills specifically and more broadly landfills in the United States, landfills alone represent about, according to the EPA, represent about 17% of US methane emissions. But this is all based on kind of self-reported data, right? So there's no global entity that's sitting there kind of surveying all of landfills and measuring the actual methane emissions. There have been some surveys done. NASA did a big survey in 2019 that actually showed that these self-reported numbers were in fact underestimated by a factor of 2 to 3x. And so this makes landfills kind of the biggest polluter in terms of methane emissions. And again, methane is anywhere from 25x to 84x more powerful than carbon dioxide, depending on kind of the time frame that you look at.
Yeah, that stat is one that when I first heard, I was just like, my mind was blown because everyone always talks about carbon dioxide, CO2, and it's very like well-known, common knowledge that that's a huge problem. But I mean, when we're when you're talking about methane, you're talking about like CO2 on steroids in terms of how bad it is. So
100%. And there's the UN has come out and said that methane reduction or methane mitigation more broadly is the strongest lever that we have as humanity to make a significant impact on slowing down climate change. And here we have a technology that's immediately available and essentially commodity level that we can go out and profitably mitigate methane emissions on a global scale. And so this was the biggest learning, is just understanding the breadth and the scope of the methane issue and understanding that we actually have a technology available to us right now that can not only mitigate that methane in an economic way, but also provide a bridge to broader sort of electrification future as being that base camp, so to speak, on a mountain, which we can definitely go into more detail later on how we plan to accomplish that.
Yeah. And regarding methane specifically, are there any other use cases or things that you're seeing out there in the market today in terms of addressing this problem? Or is Bitcoin mining really the only true solution that we have thus far, a species, to address the methane issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. It's definitely not the only tool available in the tool chest. There's several attributes about it that make it very viable in terms of scalability. So kind of to back up, if you look at, methane is obviously, essentially methane is natural gas. So there's any process that uses natural gas can use methane as a power source. So traditionally there's two types of projects that you would run on a landfill or any other source of methane. One is you would burn that methane in a power station and then inject that energy into the grid and monetize it that way. The other way would be to essentially capture that methane, compress it into, firstly filter it, so filter out all the impurities, and then compress it to high pressure and inject it into pipelines. And then you would use it in your stove or as heating in your heater or whatever it ends up being. The problem, and these are very widely used technologies, and there's a lot of the larger landfills and ones that are closer into cities have these projects actively running. In fact, I think 28% of landfills have, in the United States, 28% of landfills have active projects in the form of electricity or natural gas production. But that leaves 72% of landfills without any viable use of the gas. And that's simply because those landfills are either too small to run a traditional project profitably, or too far away from critical infrastructure. So the main driver in beneficially utilize this methane is the ability to export it. So if you're on a landfill, traditional projects that require the exportation of a commodity, whether it be electrons or molecules, the main drawback of that is the fact that you need to build out all this infrastructure in order to get that commodity to the end user. And so therefore, for the 72% of landfills that don't have a viable use for their methane, and they're either flaring it off, or in some cases, and in fact, most cases, they're just emitting it straight into the atmosphere. You need to find a way that you can place value on this energy regardless of where it's located and independent of a grid or pipeline connection. And so this is where Bitcoin mining comes in, is that Bitcoin mining is able to again, monetize energy in the form of data, and data can be transmitted readily through either satellite or cell signal. So you don't need a grid or a pipeline connection. And then not only that, Bitcoin mining is completely interruptible and it doesn't require a customer, so to speak. So there's no kind of customer acquisition. Nobody really cares if your miners go down for any period of time, because that data is not, quote unquote mission critical. God forbid your Amazon streaming would go down. And so that's why, you can't just plunk down a normal data center in these applications, is because that data is more or less mission critical. I know that and I know Crusoe is doing some great work on how to use traditional data centers in these decentralized applications. But in terms of readily available technology today that we can roll out and scalably mitigate methane, Bitcoin mining is the answer. But then once you have that Bitcoin mining going on and you're generating revenue and you're amortizing the cost of your equipment, then that really opens up a whole new level of alternative options for that energy. And one of those options, it's actually Bitcoin mining becomes like, essentially a catalyst to incentivize other users of the energy. And one example that I can give you is electrification and broadly, electric vehicle charging. If you look at a landfill is a hub of activity of vehicles. So there's from normal kind of garbage trucks, dumping their load, to normal vehicles that are coming in and out of the landfill, to other, even kind of like earth movers, like excavators and bulldozers. All of these vehicles have major companies that are putting in lots of money to electrify them. That makes a landfill kind of a perfect location for a hub of fleet electrification. What you can do with, again, because Bitcoin mining is interruptible, you can now, basically freely charge as many vehicles as you want. And the Bitcoin mining is always there to take up the slack. Because again, landfill gas, methane needs to be burned 24/7. That means your generator has to be spinning 24/7. And so you can't just sort of selectively turn on your generator when you say, okay, I have a truck coming in, I'm going to turn on my generator. You need that mining there to become the ballast, essentially, to take up any extra slack that's not being used for the vehicle charging. But then on the flip side, what this enables to do as a landfill or a landfill operator, you don't have to interface with a grid or with a utility to bring high power, high voltage, high power transmission out to your landfill, which you would need to do in a traditional setting if you wanted to set up a charging network. And so this basically like incentivizes and accelerates the adoption of electric vehicles and fleet electrification more broadly.
Yeah, no, that is so fascinating. That whole rabbit hole or tangent, whatever you want to call it, that you just went down, it is incredible. You touched on so many things. As you were talking about it, it reminded me of a conversation I had with Brandon Quittem, and he was talking about, as you know, Bitcoin mining being like the pioneer species. And what you just described is like that, but in a sense of also capturing the waste. So Bitcoin miners go out, make use of and build power generation in areas that wouldn't necessarily have it without mining, and then being used to power all these other things. And it's fascinating. I mean, I've really just, I would say, started trying to dive down and learn a lot more about this, and I've been following a lot of the research that Daniel Batten has put out, and of course Troy is always talking about different tangents along this edge. And I'm curious, in terms of how you see this conversation evolving. This is, I would say, at the forefront, especially with everything happening on the ETH moving away from proof of work towards proof of stake. I feel like it's a vector that's an important conversation to bring to the forefront, because Bitcoin just gets attacked from so many different angles. And the main one that people try using, even very intelligent people who understand the value of Bitcoin, they'll attack it for its energy. And they'll say, hey, you should use Ethereum because it doesn't consume and use all this energy. What you're talking about is not just, it's a way that you can combat that narrative with actual data, which is showing, okay, this is the effect of methane. Rather than looking at something by the amount of energy that it consumes, you look at the net effect of what's going on here. Just because something consumes energy, that doesn't give the full picture of the net effect. And what you're talking about is actually making Bitcoin very carbon negative. So on that line of thinking, I'm curious, let's say that someone out there is listening and they want to have an intelligent conversation around energy use. Are there any high level statistics that you can give them to talk about, if we want to use like your guys' system, for example, the net effect of, hey, 1 megawatt, or the system would be the equivalent of this many trees
Sure.
planted, or this many like vehicles off the road, or any types of statistics you might have on that someone can bring to a conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a bunch of different statistics that you can look at specifically from a methane mitigation perspective. I mean, I think we can say, so we think in terms of modules. What one module is about 1.5 megawatts. So, and that's approximately, let's say, 400 ASIC miners. That's kind of what fits nicely in a container, and it also happens to be a fairly common size of landfill, of small remote decentralized landfills. And so with one module in operation, that is going to, on an annual basis, in terms of the amount of methane that is now mitigated, that would be the equivalent of planting, I think, 4.2 million trees and growing them for 10 years. That's
One
just, and
point
that's
five
just one,
megawatts.
that's just one module.
How
So
long for the module again? 10 years?
in 1 year of a module
One
operating,
year to
that's the
10 years for the
equivalent.
trees.
That's
Yeah.
equivalent of 4.2 million trees growing for 10 years. In terms of the equivalent carbon dioxide reduction in the atmosphere from a greenhouse gas perspective. But I think the other way to look at it is, so Bitcoin mining, and you had mentioned it gets a lot of just bad rap in general for its energy usage. I think that energy usage by itself is not necessarily a bad thing, right? It's a question of how that energy is obtained. And today let's say there's some percentage of Bitcoin mining that's still happening on coal. Then there's an increasing percentage of Bitcoin mining that's being done via solar, wind, hydro, these types of applications. And then also increasing number of mining that's done via methane sources. And if you look at that kind of thread, and you look at companies like us and then like Crusoe and other similar companies in the space, as we expand and more hash rate comes on the network from carbon negative sources, because that methane again is that 25 to 84x, a very small growth in our company as a very big contribution to the overall carbon negativeness of Bitcoin network as a whole. So there's a very realistic timeline and sort of pathway to the Bitcoin network becoming globally carbon negative, even though there's always going to be some contributions of carbon positive sources. There's going to be some contribution of carbon neutral sources, and then an increasing contribution of carbon negative sources, such that as an aggregate, the network becomes carbon negative, which is something that you can't necessarily say about Ethereum or a proof of stake. Is the best that they can hope for is carbon neutrality.
It's kind of funny to hear that, right? Because so much of the mainstream conversation around this is talking about how, Ethereum's trying to help the environment and move away from proof of work. But really, what you just explained with this technology, and what I truly believe as well, is that this is a net positive in that conversation. And one other point that I think it's important for us to touch on is, I think a lot of the people who speak about it don't understand the true value of Bitcoin in the long term. And, I think that we all play our own role in where we fit into the Bitcoin network, right? I think that what you guys are doing is unbelievably important and very good from an environmental conservationist standpoint. And then you have other people who are mining that might not necessarily be, carbon negative, but they're still contributing to the network in some type of way. What I think is interesting about your guys' approach as well is how the incentives line up for the cost of that power. And so maybe if you want to just give some high level talking points as well, like how expensive is it to mine on methane? What are the benefits? What are the challenges? How does that look? Because it's a completely different type of approach than if you go and work with a utility, right? Just how it's set up, how the cost structure looks, and the scalability. What are some of those benefits and challenges that you face when trying to run your project, for example?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that, it's important to draw a distinction from the perspective that, we don't think of our company as a Bitcoin mining company. Bitcoin mining is not really our end game necessarily. Our goal is to be firstly a methane mitigation company, and then secondly, a long-term energy developer. Bitcoin mining, and also to Brandon, I've had a couple of conversations with him on Twitter, and we're both actually mushroom hunters, but we can get into that later. But so this concept of the the pioneer species is very much in play with our model, because from the perspective of, using Bitcoin mining as that, as that sort of base layer, or that base camp on a mountain to achieve these other uses in the long term. But looking at methane, so a landfill is going to be producing methane for decades, for generations even. So as long as that landfill is open and accepting, new trash, that landfill is going to be producing more and more methane over time, because you have the contribution of the older garbage as well as the new garbage. So as that landfill gets bigger, it's going to be producing more and more methane. And that's generally on average, I think, about 3 to 4% year over year in terms of increased methane production. And even if you were to close a landfill, like I was just talking about in Berkeley, if you close a landfill, that landfill is still going to be producing methane for 40, 50 years and beyond. Like, it's going to start trickling down, but it's still producing more and more. And so, this makes a landfill basically a very long-term energy source. Right. And so from that perspective, it's very important for us to make sure that as an energy producer or an electricity producer, that we have a very low sort of production cost, right? And so we take kind of great care in making sure that we select the right equipment for the job, and that the landfill gas is properly cleaned and processed kind of prior to going into the generator. So, if you add in kind of our cost structure plus what we pay to the landfill itself, and we can go into sort of how we structure that. But we have sort of like an overall all-in cost of somewhere in the 3 cent a kilowatt range, with when you add in, amortize, cost of production in terms of your maintenance on your generator and your maintenance on your conditioning equipment. And so from that perspective, the trade-off there is that we have a higher capex, right? So typically speaking, we have a higher capex than you would have in a traditional mining setting, as you're sort of buying grid power and you set up a big facility, or even oil and gas flare mitigation. We have a higher capex than them, again, because we have this other step required to kind of clean the landfill gas. Landfill gas has a bunch of kind of impurities in it that generally speaking, they mess up or muck up the generator. But the trade-off is that we have a very predictable and constant source of methane with a low cost of production. So therefore, it's key for us to use that Bitcoin mining at the front end to extract as much value as we can, and then sort of constantly be on the search for hedges to that revenue stream in the form of electric vehicle charging or from Grid Connect itself.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible, how low cost the ongoing operations are for that type of a model. But definitely, with its own challenges in terms of the scalability per site and everything else. So fascinating. And in terms of actually sourcing these landfills and then spreading, it sounds like you guys are building like a decentralized network of these power generation sources that can be used for mining or used for other things, and be located in remote areas. And so, I mean, in terms of like a game plan, long-term vision, it seems like you could go in so many directions. As of today, what would you say is the main focus, and where do you see this potentially going?
Yeah, I mean, our focus right now is kind of a combination of, landfills are split up into two different categories. There's private landfills, which are owned and operated by private companies, which are, there's some big players in the industry like Waste Management and Republic Services. You've probably seen their logos on the side of garbage trucks. So these are the big players in sort of the private sector. And then so they're split up about 50-50. So 50% private and then 50% public, which are owned and operated by municipalities, so a city or a county. And our efforts are kind of split up between those two. So we're engaging with private companies in terms of getting sort of a portfolio approach to expansion. Public entities are much more kind of onesie twosies, and that requires kind of more business development and education and sort of outreach in general. But I think our general strategy is we're certainly not beholden to the US at all. So I mean, we're using the United States and the regulatory framework as a springboard, such that we can set up a model that we can then extrapolate and scale into other jurisdictions internationally. If you think the methane problem is bad in the United States, wait until you look at the global south and developing countries in terms of there's much bigger problems and bigger fish to fry in other places in the world. I mean, the US, certainly we can make a big impact, but I think the bigger impact kind of climate wise and potentially socially will be made in international jurisdictions.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of education that you guys are must be involved in and teaching everyone about this. Because I mean, I've spoken with people from different utilities and the non-technologists, but the energy side. And I'm curious, what are some of the most like ridiculous or not ridiculous, but crazy questions that you've had to field when you've been speaking with these people who are completely outside of Bitcoin or cryptocurrency industries?
Yeah, well, I think the main one is that comes up fairly often is, how do you know that there's Bitcoin in the landfill? That one comes up a lot. But I think that the way that we approach that is by sort of describing Bitcoin mining in terms of data processing. And I think that, that's the main thing that is kind of that aha moment with people is that if you describe it in the data sense that you're essentially operating a decentralized data center and you're monetizing data, which is being sent remotely. And so therefore we don't require the grid connection or pipeline. That then it starts to click with people. And then they can see how it can solve their problem. A lot of the landfills that we're talking to have been and are generally overlooked by the larger developers because of the reasons that I mentioned. One example was Phil that we were talking to, which, I think they were flaring 700 some odd cubic feet per minute of landfill gas, which would be, enough for, let's say, more than one module. So let's say a 2 megawatt opportunity. And they had a request for proposal out for a year. And they had hired kind of a private, independent consultant to kind of see and do a feasibility study and et cetera, et cetera. And basically this consultant came back and said, well, sorry, like this is just not a fit for beneficial use. So you're just going to be flaring for the rest of your life. And then we come along and sort of provide this solution, and so
You go look at
it's
it and they're like, it looks like there's like 27 Bitcoin in here. I think that we can go and build something up and get some if you work with us.
yeah. So this is the kind of the baseline of conversation that we have with people is that we're solving a very known and present problem with how to properly monetize small and medium-sized decentralized landfill methane.
No, it's great. And in terms of like your background and your conservationist approach to things, are there things that you think that people should be talking about or mentioning when they're having these conversations? Because I feel like a lot of times, I guess I'm circling back to what's happening with Ethereum right now because it's the news of the day. But and also before even diving into that, I just want to say that I think it's an incredible technological feat of what we saw with Ethereum being able to make that transition and make that move. But granted, a lot of times with Bitcoin or Ethereum or these different communities, people get very tribal, right? And they're like, it's like my way or the highway. And then you have the attack vectors on the communities, and a lot of times it comes back to energy. From your perspective, what's the right way to have this conversation around energy use and Bitcoin mining? And what do you think are some of the things that should be given a spotlight that might not be given a spotlight right
Yeah, I mean, certainly I guess to back up a little bit, about, I think 5 days ago or so, there was a report that was put out by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy that was written specifically about the climate effects of what they called crypto mining. And the report definitely was flawed. It definitely had references to dubious sources, which have been sort of, by and large debunked by, industry analysts. But there were some very positive parts of that report, specifically regarding mining's contributions from a methane mitigation standpoint. And actually, landfills were mentioned specifically as one application of mining that is in line with the administration's broad, climate goals. And so this was this was timely and exciting for us that was actually mentioned in this report. But I think the best way to have the conversation is to have data to go along with it. I think that's the main, there's a difference between like, we're a startup. We're building our pilot site right now. We have another 10 sites that are sort of in the pipeline, but without having quote unquote steel in the ground yet, it's essentially just conjecture in terms of the actual climate benefits. And so once we're up to scale and we have steel in the ground, we projects operational, then we can sort of, and that's kind of our biggest contribution is just build. We're not going to be the ones that are going to be fighting with whoever about whether it's proof of stake or proof of work. Like, frankly, like I don't really care about Ethereum. I think, Ethereum is potentially a sort of a corporate equity at this point. And so in our view, Bitcoin is a completely different animal than any other sort of cryptocurrency, even though they both get labeled as cryptocurrencies. But I think it's wrong to assume that Bitcoin and quote unquote crypto are in the same box. That being said, we're not out there to preach about any purported positives or negatives about any specific blockchain or what have you. Again, our biggest contribution is just to build and show the beneficial climate effects of Bitcoin mining in our specific use case.
Yeah. And I love the way you said that too, where they are very different things. I feel like a lot of people group so many of these different networks together. And I'm of the complete same belief that I think Bitcoin is a completely different animal. I like to draw the analogy between sports. And so, for example, I'll give two that I play. I'm very into tennis. I'm very into chess as well. I'm not sure if you could consider that a sport, but you could use another sport like football, for example. Football, tennis, chess, these are all extremely different activities, but you can all group them in something like calling it a sport. And
Sure.
I think that that's the same type of thing that people do with like cryptocurrencies. They might just say crypto or with blockchain, and they'll start making these groupings that inherently have very little in common. It's almost like just calling it a sport. And I think that's a very good delineation that you just made there.
Yeah, totally. At the same, in the same breath, it's not really our place to comment politically on the merits of either one. I'm sure that, I'm sure there's valid use cases for Ethereum and that's great. It's just again completely different than, if you're like, again, you like tennis, you probably couldn't care less about what was happening in the rugby world, so.
Yeah, that's true. I'm one of those people, like I'll watch sports and like even if I know nothing about the sport, I'll just like when you see a good like competitors going at it and you see a good competition, you could not really know any of the nuances of what's going on, but it'll just grip you, and I do really enjoy tennis and I watch
I like
football.
how the two things that you mentioned, tennis and chess, are the two things that I'm like the worst at.
Oh, really? What were your
I'm
sports?
I play baseball. I still play baseball, actually. I'm in a vintage baseball league where we play by the 1886 rule book. But yeah, my main sports historically were baseball and swimming, actually.
Oh, that's
So
awesome.
yeah.
That's actually really funny because on my end too, those are like opposites. The two things I never actually played baseball and swimming, I was just like the worst at. Like I was unbelievably bad at swimming. So I never did that, but that's really funny. What position did you play in baseball?
So I'm a catcher. So I've always,
Okay,
I've
cool.
always been a catcher my entire life. So I was trained as a catcher, and it was sort of my, just my position from childhood. I never took the, there was a pause in my sort of baseball career. I pursued engineering in college, and that was, more time consuming than would be applicable to spend on a sport. But in the last 10 years, I sort of picked it up again by joining this vintage league. So which has been a big part of my weekend activities. So
Yeah, so I'm really curious, and I think that the reason why I never really got into baseball is because I just never, none of my friends growing up ever played it. I never really got to speak about it. So I guess I'm going to learn right now about at least how a catcher thinks, right? So when you're playing, I understand baseline the rules of how
sure.
baseball works and everything, and I've watched brief parts of games, and you always see the catcher making these different signs. There are different types of pitches. I guess what are some of the things, like the decisions that you make when you're playing that position as a catcher? Are there particular things that like the best ones do better than everyone else? Because I feel like they always catch it, like right at the end of the
Sure.
day. But like what is the differentiator that makes someone like
Yeah.
MLB level versus like a
Sure.
D1 player.
Catcher is sort of it's one of the more underappreciated positions, because it's kind of a lose tie scenario. If you catch the ball, that's like, okay, that's baseline of what you're supposed to do, right? So it's hard to determine kind of the sort of the effects of a good catcher are more under the surface. So they're sort of
Mm.
like, so catcher is a very cerebral position. You have to be constantly thinking about the runners that are on base, the sort of the situation in the game. You have a view of the entire game, which is sort of different than everybody else. I think the primary effect would be on sort of calling the correct pitch, which may not be true in major leagues. A lot of times the manager will call the pitches, but so I'm sort of analyzing. I'm looking at the batter. I'm thinking about how he's thinking. I'm seeing how far he's standing off the plate, and I'm thinking about what the count is, and then I sort of determine what the best pitch would be for that particular situation. So it's very strategic in that sense. And you also have to be looking at, when there's a runner on second, is that runner going to be looking at your signs and trying to steal them and communicate that to the batter? So you have to look at his cues as well, and then you might have to switch up your signs so that you have, your signs mean something different depending on who's on base. So it's a very cerebral kind of strategic position, which I think it kind of fits well with my engineering background and I, just broadly being an entrepreneur and a CEO.
Yeah,
So
I was thinking about that as we're going through. I'm like, I could see you doing well in that position. That's fascinating, though. Yes, is that legal for the person who's runner on second base to like
sure
give
is.
whatever signs that he wants to the?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's definitely a strategy, and so you always have to, there's sort of two ways to get through that. You do sort of a sequence of signs, and then you tell the pitcher which number in that sequence is the correct sign. So you would be like, if it's the third sign, you could go like 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it would be, you're doing a three, which would be a change up or something. And then, or you do an indicator, and an indicator is basically, if you say, okay, the indicator is two, then it's like whatever the sign is after I give a two is the right sign. And so these are different ways of,
Oh,
yeah.
interesting. So,
Hmm.
slight analogy between tennis. So there's singles and there's doubles, of course. And in
Hmm.
doubles, you'll see if you've ever watched professional tennis, they'll have one hand. The person at the net will have one hand behind their back, and then they'll start giving signs.
Mm.
But in tennis, it's a lot more. It's not like all this trickery that goes on really as much between the
Hmm.
signs. It's like you first will say, okay, I want you to serve here. So the first serve, like it's kind of behind the back, but it'll be like here, like down the middle, out wide. And then sometimes like if you want like a kick serve, you can go like that.
Hmm.
You're like, hey, I want you to kick it to the backhand, like top spin, so it jumps out that way. But
Interesting.
then so you'll do the direction first, and then the second sign will be like what you're doing at the net. So like you might stay where you are, or you might say, hey, I want to poach, and like right after you serve and it goes by, I'm going to go off and try and poach the ball off the top of the net. So you at the
Mm.
baseline are going to know that. So there are all these signs that go, but it's very like put it here, and this is what I'm going to do, and
Mm.
like you'll be like stay, go, or fake poach. And
Mm.
it's much more
Interesting.
simple, but there's no like, hey, I'm gonna do this in case someone gives the sign away, because it would be cheating in tennis to give away the sign.
That's
But
fascinating.
I mean, people probably found a way to do it, but
Right.
yeah, I
I
mean,
heard I heard about I heard about a guy cheating in chess recently too. But
oh my God, this has been big news. This
yeah.
has been big news. I mean, if we clip this with just something about that and say, hey, it's about like the Hans cheating scandal, it'll blow up. Like there's been so much speculation around that right now. It's pretty wild. I mean, I like follow it like at a high level, but that
Hmm.
stuff is crazy. And I feel like it's weird when you look at a sport like chess, right? Because it's a solved game to a certain
Hmm.
extent. Like in the sense that the best players in the world can't beat the engines. And so it just kind of opens it up to cheating. And apparently
Sure.
this guy had been caught cheating before a couple of
Hmm.
times. And then
Hmm.
Magnus Carlsen, like the number one player in the world, pulls out of the tournament after
Hmm.
losing to him, but doesn't say why. So it's just like all this chess drama going on right
Yeah,
now,
that's
which
crazy.
is kind of funny. I mean, chess has blown up since the
That
Queen's
show,
Gambit.
the Netflix show. Yeah, exactly.
That's what got me back into it. I played it a pretty good amount when I was growing up, and then I kind of just stopped. You kind of forget about it, but that show kind of like it got me back into it for some
That's
reason.
interesting. Yeah, I'm more of a mahjong guy actually myself.
I've never played.
Yeah, I used to live in China, so I spent a lot of time learning mahjong and playing that. So that'd be like my typical sit down game, I think, at this point.
I want to make sure I'm thinking of the right game. What's the setup for Mahjong?
You're at a table, you've got four players. It's a little bit like and you've got these tiles that kind of look like thick dominoes, but it's more essentially of a card. It's a card game, but you use dominoes. I mean, it's very similar to like gin rummy,
So
but
it,
there's a whole betting thing that goes on, and there's sort of multipliers of, if you make a really good hand, you get sort of a multiplier against your winnings. It's pretty cool.
is it kind of like a poker type style where you're just winning against other people, or is it like a
Yeah,
casino? Okay.
it's you're just winning against other people.
Yeah, that's
So,
interesting. There are a lot of fun games out there.
yeah.
You can, I feel like it's one of those things where I don't know about you, but I've always just been very like into games. And
Mm-hmm.
if you go and learn about all of them, then you'll all of a sudden look around, you'll be like, how did I just waste my entire day like playing these games, like just playing chess or I have the app and sometimes I will be on that app for like
Mm-hmm.
3.5 hours straight.
Well, do you know the backstory of where the name Vespene comes from?
No, I'd love to hear it. Where does it come from?
Well, so Vespene, so there was a game that was sort of very fundamental in my, because I'm a big gamer, video gamer, etc. There was a very instrumental or influential game, StarCraft, which you've likely heard of. But
Yeah.
Vespene gas is a resource in StarCraft that you have to manage or capture in order to really make your civilization get to the next level. And so, from our perspective, we are essentially taking a gas and putting it into a digital asset. And so it had this very, very clear sort of delineation with Vespene gas in the game. That was how the name came.
That's awesome. When you were
Yeah.
brainstorming for the name, was there like did it just like hit you like out of inspiration one day, or was it something like sitting down, like figuring out how did you come up with that?
It sort of just hit us. I mean, like, so my name is Adam Wright. So we couldn't really call it Wright mining. That wouldn't have the same ring as you guys, but sort of a, more boring name. But yeah, I mean, it just sort of came out randomly. It was, we just thought of it like kind of naturally.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really great. And
Hmm.
I do really like absolutely love what you guys are doing. I love the mission.
Hmm.
I think it's incredible. And I'm wishing you guys the best of success in your current pilot. And then it sounds like you guys have quite a few people who are municipalities, landfills that you could help out after you have and prove out this pilot.
Hmm.
I always finish up the conversations with a quick question.
Hmm.
And it's a question that's designed to kind of figure out, the way that you look at the world, ways that you might be looking at things differently than others. And I'm always fascinated to hear the answers on this question. So the question is what is one belief you hold to be true that the majority of people would disagree? And I think that there's the obvious one that, a large part of this conversation is centered around. So if there's any, and it can be anything, it could be crypto, Bitcoin, blockchain, or not related to that at all. It's a tough
Yeah.
question, so I'll give you
That is
give
a
you a
good.
second
That
to
is the
think
best question.
about
No,
it if you want.
it's a tough question. I mean, I think you can look at it. I mean, so I think that so we hold things true as a company in the sense that we firmly believe and want to show with data that Bitcoin mining will be an overwhelmingly positive force for good. And whether that force for good is for climate benefits or whether it's to incentivize electric vehicle adoption or whether it's just to broadly incentivize electrification in general. I would say that, so we hold that very, very dear and close to heart. And so I think that, but that phrase, I think, would not be shared by the majority of people right now, just based on sort of the typical media attention and negativity placed to energy and just not or and the energy consumption of Bitcoin and just the lack of nuance with sort of energy and emissions not necessarily being kind of directly related. So that was what I would say it would be our, the thing that we again, believe to be true, but probably is not believed by the vast majority of people. But our goal is to by virtue of of our company being here and scaling, that we want to change that narrative over time. And I think a lot of companies in the Bitcoin space, a lot of companies might shy away from, or similar companies that were to be in our same shoes may shy away of trying to kind of hide Bitcoin in the mix and saying, oh, we're going to build data centers, and sort of not even try to mention Bitcoin by name. But we actually want to take a Bitcoin narrative and show by virtue of our company that we're able to make and use Bitcoin as a tool to enable these other opportunities. And it's possible that we'll lose some contracts as a result of that, but it's also important for us to just be honest about what we're doing, and the fact that and spread that messaging. I mean, like, by working with public municipalities, kind of spreading awareness around Bitcoin, kind of site by site and municipality by municipality, and sort of helping to quote unquote orange pill people as we go is all part of the mission and the education. So excited to meet up again in a year or so and see, kind of revisit some of these questions.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I'm looking forward to see how you guys progress. Also, for everyone who's listening out there, where can they follow what you guys are doing? Are there any social handles or things that you can direct them to?
For sure. So our Twitter account is Vespene_energy. My personal account is digital_ore, so digital ore. And then you can get us online at vespene.energy. So looking forward to having some dialogue with some of your listeners.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for coming on. This was so much fun, and yeah, we'll have you on after, or I guess probably about a year from now. So you guys are fully up and running.
Sounds good, Will. Yeah.
All right.
Take care.
Thanks.